Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. I've decided to mix things up a little bit today. I'm not going to actually go into chapter 7 today. I think we're just going to talk about historical context because I know that that's really one of the most difficult things. And so I just wanted to talk about that to explain some things from chapter 6 and then also to make sense of chapter 7. We really just need an entire time where we step back, sort of see the forest for the trees, and get the greater context of what's going on here. There's so much historical context that you need to know for Isaiah, not only political history, but religious history, that we really just need to take a step back and talk about it. So, one thing that I've mentioned before that I think needs to be explained more is the orality of this text. Today we sit down and we read books, right? That's just kind of what we do. We sit down with a book, we read it to ourselves in our head, and a lot of times we never even say the words out loud. But that is kind of a foreign concept. I mean, think about it. Before the advent of the printing press, books are very rare. Books are made to be read to a large audience because they are so rare. And let's be honest, how many people are literate anyway? So the people that are literate will read the small number of books to those who are not literate. That's why a lot of churches are sort of designed on that pattern because it goes back to a sort of pre-literate period. And I think that's what we're looking at here. Isaiah was not meant to be read to yourself. It was meant to be read out loud. And so a lot of times you'll see puns in the book of Isaiah, small plays on words and things like that I brought up. That serves two purposes. One, it allows him to talk to two audiences at once, like we've talked about, but also it helps people to remember them. These sort of plays on words and puns orally help people to remember the sermons, to be able to write them down later. That's probably really what we're looking at. Isaiah probably is not writing stuff down very often. In fact, God has to go out of his way at one point to say, Isaiah, why don't you actually physically write this down? He says, write this with a man's pen. Presumably, the idea is that, yes, you're speaking this, and this is recorded in heaven, and sort of the book, sort of big book in heaven that we see from other parts of the Hebrew Bible. But no, I need you to physically write this down right now. So presumably, Isaiah is not doing much actual writing. He's probably speaking this to his audience. His audience is memorizing it and then writing it down. But you might say, well, how can his audience remember all this stuff to write it down? Isaiah is so complicated. Well, it goes back to his little puns. These little puns help to keep the audience on track. The plays on words are sort of arranged within the sermon so that it can help you remember the flow of the sermon. And in fact, there was a guy who went down to what used to be Yugoslavia some time ago and did a bunch of studies of oral poetry. These sort of guys, almost like Homer, who were giving these big epic poems for people to memorize, and found that that was how they do it. That's how they do it. That's how they memorize these really long things. Is these small plays on words throughout the story help you to remember everything. So probably Isaiah is speaking these sermons. His audience is memorizing them because in the days before books, people were very, very good at memorizing stuff. So probably these people are memorizing it. Some of them, where scribes, are writing them down, and then eventually they are compiled. But that that causes some problems because how are they compiling it? Are they compiling it topically, or are they compiling it chronologically? Well, they are probably not compiling it chronologically. Note that chapter 6, we just did chapter 6, but that's his calling as a prophet. It should have been the very first chapter. So probably this is arranged topically, not chronologically. Something akin to our Presence of the Church manuals, right? That people are taking these general topics and arranging things that way instead of going through and just blowing through chronologically. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to realize that that's probably what's going on here. Isaiah may actually have done some writing himself. Like I said, God tells him at one point to do some writing, but a lot of it definitely seems to be other people writing down his sermons, and then eventually it all gets compiled. I don't think that we should be upset about this or feel like this makes it a less credible witness, because a lot of people would have probably been involved in the process. They would have remembered these sermons and then written it down, so that we probably are getting a surprisingly good witness here of what Isaiah actually said. But when you see these word plays and things like that, it's because probably this is meant to be an oral text. People, sitting down and reading to themselves is just kind of strange historically. Even Virgil, as late as Virgil, the idea was that the Aeneid was supposed to be read out loud to each other, and that's down the Roman period, hundreds and hundreds of years after Isaiah. So it seems pretty clear this is meant to be a performance text, either read out loud and written down by his audience, or possibly he's writing it down himself. Although, like I said, that whole thing about writing it down seems to be the exception that sort of proves the rule, that if he has to be told to write it down, probably he's giving these sermons, others are writing them down, and eventually they get compiled. But that's why we have to go through really the whole historical context of Isaiah, so that as we jump around chronologically, I can tell you where we are and you can attach it to something. Because some things that came up in chapter 6 and some things that will come up in chapter 7 are so dependent on chronology that I decided we really need to give you the whole background and then we can dive into it later. So with that in mind, I'd just like to sort of give a rundown of a brief history of Israel. So really, in order to make sense of this, you kind of need the quick and dirty of Israelite history, which is as follows. So you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right, back in the day. Jacob has 12 kids. They're called the 12 tribes of Israel because his name gets changed to Israel. They all go down to Egypt and then stay there. They become the 12 tribes of Israel, but then Pharaoh decides to make them slaves. So they're slaves in Egypt. Moses bails them out. They go back up into the Holy Land, and most of them cross over the river and settle in between the strip that is the Mediterranean Sea and the line sort of running down between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and then down south to the Red Sea. So there's this sliver of the Holy Land, well, the sliver of the Middle East that they settle in. And they're really divided into tribes at this point. There are 12 tribes. Actually, there are 13. That's kind of confusing, but yes, there are 13. So there's Joseph. Even though there's only 12 sons, Joseph gets a double portion. So Ephraim and Manasseh, his two sons, become two tribes. So that gives you actually 13. But Levi doesn't get a land inheritance because he operates the temples, and so Levi's just scattered everywhere, lives all over, and then goes to work at the temple, and that's what sort of keeps him alive. He basically lives off of tithing, effectively. And so there's 13 tribes, but only 12 of them get land. Okay, so the north has 10 tribes, and the south has 2 tribes. It seems that this north-south division is sort of a long-standing thing. Like I said, there are very strong tribal affiliations for a long time, but there also does seem to be a little bit of a north-south divide as well. But Saul, David, and Solomon kind of overcome these sectional differences and unite them into one big happy family for a short amount of time. But Solomon's son is kind of a jerk, and so it breaks up again into, instead of 12 this time, just the 2, just the north, which is called Israel, northern 10 tribes, and then the southern 2 tribes, Judah, and then Simeon, basically, but also a little bit of Benjamin. We'll look at that in a map in a second. So you have this division between north and south, but the northern and the southern kingdom don't really like each other, and in fact they go to war with each other quite a bit. If you're looking at the map here, you can just come back and look at the map anytime if you're listening to this as a podcast. But if you're watching the video, you see Jerusalem there in the middle. Pretty much north of Jerusalem is Israel, and south of Jerusalem is Judah, and that's sort of the line there is through Jerusalem. But they just hate each other, and they're always going at it all the time. And that obviously means that things are not quite as stable for either of them as they would like, and in fact there are lots of succession crises up north. There are lots of kings who just reign for a short time and then get overthrown up in the north. And the south is more stable, but the north has some major issues like that. So now as we move on here, you can see from this map, this is the division of all the 12 tribes. So some of them are east of the river Jordan. Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh are east of the river Jordan, and the rest are then west of the River Jordan. The line there, you can see this blue line. Like I said, you can come back and look at this later if you're just listening to it. There's this blue line that sort of runs right through the middle. Jerusalem kind of is on the border between north and south, so this line actually isn't totally perfect. But Jerusalem was kind of a no man's land for a long time. That's why David made it his capital, as a way to sort of bridge north and south and sort of the divisions there. Similar to Washington, D.C., right? It's right in the middle between north and south in what used to be a swamp, as a way to sort of say, well, I'm totally neutral. I'm not in anybody's land. Technically, this falls in Benjamin's territory, but they didn't occupy it. It was Jebusite territory, and then David occupied it. So, anyway, there's this major north-south division, and they're always fighting each other all the time. But you can see where those two kingdoms would be, and now, one problem that the Israelites constantly have is not just with each other. They have problems with the Philistines, and they have problems militarily with the Philistines, but they have other kinds of problems with the Phoenicians, and we'll actually look at a map of them in a second. But they're constantly having issues with their neighbors that surround them. So as you can see here, as we move on to this next map, you can see in the north Phoenicia, and then in the south, Philistia. It's hard to remember all these small countries that surround Israel and Judah, but I'll give you an easy way to remember them all. So you have Judah. Judah is the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, and then south all the way down to the Red Sea, really. And then the northern is Israel. So west of the Jordan, it's easy to remember that. Phoenicia, Israel, and then Philistia spell out the word Pip, P-I-P. Okay, easy to remember. Then east of the Jordan, it's more complicated. There's a lot of little countries. Well, up in the north is Aram and Damascus, or Syria. Okay, like we have Syria today, it's roughly the same location. Syria. Then you have Ammon. Then you have Moab, south of that, and then you have Edom. The east of the River Jordan is divided by dried stream beds into strips. That's why there's so many kingdoms there, because those dried stream beds used to be the boundaries between these kingdoms. So Syria, or Aram Damascus, then Ammon, Moab, Edom. Spells out the word same. And that's an easy way to remember those guys. These guys are all different. They all have a very different character. The Phoenicians are seafarers. They're this sort of rough and tumble adventurers of the ancient world. They have colonies all over the Mediterranean, North Africa, Spain, really all over. Some indication they went all the way out to England. They had this huge commercial empire and founded it on purple dye. There are these little seashells that live up there, these little sea creatures that live up there where they are, and their shells make excellent purple dye. They also make excellent steel. They have this way of taking the crushed up shells after they've made dye with them and making small batches of steel. Steel used to be, now steel is very common. You use it in building and cans and everything, but that's because of something called the Bessemer system. Before that, steel was very precious and very desirable as a weapon because it was very hard, a very hard material. You usually had really small stuff made out of steel because it was so hard to produce. But you'll notice Nephi gets a steel sword. That is a lot of steel, and it's this kind of steel. This is probably a Phoenician kind of steel. That's why even when he's so distracted, that's part of the reason why I think he notices the sword. Wow, it's a steel sword. Presumably Phoenician steel is this carbon and calcium strengthened steel. Very nice weapon. But yeah, these Phoenicians are tradesmen who've made their money off of this purple dye, and they're very rich, and they have a lot of pagan gods that they worship. And the Israelites really like this, Israel especially, but also Judah. And so they're continuously adopting their customs and adopting their gods, and the prophets keep having to be like, don't do that, this is not a good idea. So they actually have a lot of problems because of Phoenicia. Now Philistia down in the south, Philistia is farther south along the coast. Phoenicia is where Lebanon is today. Philistia is basically actually where the Gaza Strip today, at least part of it. But it's kind of this big strip on the coast. The Philistines are probably some flavor of Greeks that have settled there during this kind of crazy period. And so the Israelites are always having to deal with them. They're these really big, tough guys, and the Israelites are always trying to fight them. David eventually is able to do pretty well with them, but they're just always kind of a thorn in Israel's side. Um, Syria, now after Israel and Judah break up, Syria um, is always going in and trying to raid Israel and giving them a lot of problems. And so that's something that is a huge issue for them, is always trying to fend off the Syrians. But then you have also Ammon and Moab and Edom down there. They have some problems with them sometimes. Sometimes they're on friendly-ish terms with them. But they're always kind of at odds with their neighbors. And so one thing also to remember is there's Syria and then there's Assyria. That really comes from an unfortunate way of putting that into English. The Syrians, that name really is Aram. And they're up there in what is now Syria. But it really probably should be pronounced Suria. And then Ashuria is Assyria. So it sounds actually a lot different in the languages that comes from. In English it sounds the same, but they are different. So Syria is where Syria is today, up there just north of Israel and Lebanon area. And then Assyria is in sort of northern Iraq, and then a lot of Turkey in that area. A lot of Kurdish territory, actually. Those guys are big in the news right now, but that's kind of their domain, is Assyria, to a great extent anyway. Assyria was bigger, but they cover a lot of the same territory. So that's kind of the rundown of that, at least for sort of Israel and their neighbors, and then why they sort of have problems with their neighbors sometimes. But eventually, the Israelites and Judah have a lot more to worry about than just the Assyrians and the Philistines. They have much bigger fish to fry when the Assyrians get on the scene. They have this massive, massive empire that's really built on military victory. That's what they do. Their god is a war god, and they just fight and win. They win all the time because they're really, really good at what they do. They're especially brutal, actually. There's a relief from one of the palaces of the kings of Assyria, of a king of Assyria throwing a garden party, and he has decorated the tree for this party, one of the trees in his garden, with severed heads. So these guys are really, really tough. Excellent, excellent warriors, and they just kind of sweep the earth before them. They have an empire at one point that is pretty much all of Iraq, a lot of Turkey, a lot of Iran, actually, at least pieces of what is currently Iran. They just have this huge, huge empire down into the Holy Land, into Egypt. They just occupy this huge, huge area, and they kind of seem like they're unstoppable. And so this brings us to the kings here. It keeps talking about all these different kings. So Isaiah is living during the lifetime of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And during their lifetimes, these guys are all trying to figure out how to deal with the Assyrian Empire, how to not just get gobbled up, basically, by this massive empire who seems to just be sweeping the earth before it. And so they all try to sort of cope in different ways, honestly. So you have Uzziah and then Jotham, who just kind of seem to try to stay out of the way. But then what happens is Syria and Israel kind of force Judah's hand. They decide to attack. And so King Ahaz decides to make a deal with the devil, and by the devil I mean the Assyrians, and he makes a deal with them saying, hey, listen, if you go and take out Syria and Israel, I'll be your friend. And I'll help you sort of beat these guys. So he makes a deal with the Assyrians, and the Assyrians take out Israel, and they take out Syria as well. But then Ahaz becomes basically a vassal of the Assyrians. So, this Faustian pact doesn't really work out for him. He basically becomes a vassal of the Assyrians. And, really, vassal is a close step away, a very small step away from being basically absorbed by the empire, by the Assyrian Empire. And so it's not the greatest place to be. And so this ends up being a huge problem for Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, that's why he kind of hates everything his father stands for. So a lot of these kings are really, really bad, but Hezekiah is one of the first good ones. And I think he just hates all that his father stood for so much that he says, I'm just going to try to fix everything. So his dad, Ahaz, was definitely not a nationalist, and he definitely didn't really believe in Jehovah. He actually messed up a bunch of stuff in the temple. He tried to adopt a bunch of Assyrian religious practices, actually ruined some of the stuff in the temple and to use it to pay the Assyrians. At least that's the impression. And so there are some major issues there. And so Hezekiah just says, you know what, forget you, Dad. Forget your religious policy. Forget your political policy. I'm going to rebel against the Assyrians, and we're going to go back to worshiping Jehovah. And so Hezekiah is kind of one of these champions in the Old Testament. You just can't help but love this guy. He really tries to sort of put things on the right path again, and you can't help but admire him for that. But that brings us to some of his religious reforms, because the political reforms and the religious reforms are kind of one and the same. Ashur is the god of Assyria, is a god who is predominantly known for warfare. He's just good at killing stuff. But you'll notice in Exodus that it says Jehovah is a god of war. Exodus 15. And in fact, you see him represented as a war god pretty consistently. So it's kind of the battle of the war gods now, Ashur versus Jehovah. Which one's better? Which one's going to win? And Hezekiah says, well, clearly Jehovah's going to win. And Isaiah backs him on that, obviously, and we'll get to some of that later. But Hezekiah says, if we're going to rebel against Assyria politically, we need to rebel religiously too. And so he said, we're going to go back to worshiping Jehovah. We're going to do things right. So Hezekiah fixes everything as far as sort of getting idolatry out of the system. But this is where we run into some difficulty. It seems that there were things like something called matzevot. This is the plural of matzevah, these standing stones. You see that in Genesis. Jacob, when he has this vision, and he wants to mark the place as a holy place at Bethel, he takes this big rock and he puts it on an end and he pours oil on top, and he marks it as a sacred place, and that's called a matzevah. And that is something that seems to be acceptable in the past, but eventually those kinds of things begin to be used only for idolatry, is the impression that I get. And so then Hezekiah says, you know what, these used to be okay, but they're not anymore because you guys are using them for idolatry, so we're going to destroy them. And Isaiah actually sometimes talks about this, sort of wistfully thinking about the time when they used to have all these extra things that were okay, because they had to destroy them because people were using them improperly. And in fact, Hezekiah destroys the brazen serpent that Moses made. The children of Israel had started to worship it, so he wipes it out too. He's just brutal in destroying stuff. If the children of Israel had turned it into an idol. So regardless of its origins, if it's become idolatrous, Hezekiah destroys it. So these matzevot, these standing stones that seem to have been part of, probably a legitimate part of worship, Hezekiah destroys. He destroys the brazen serpent. Also destroys a bunch of stuff called Asherah, which are these, we really have no idea what they are. Something like poles. These are sort of poles, trees, or something that you use in worship. They had, by the time of Hezekiah, they had been adopted pretty much exclusively for idolatry. And in fact, when it talks about groves, a lot of the times that's what it's talking about. So it does seem that there have been at times valid ways to use these things, but very quickly they become idolatrous. And Hezekiah says, "Nope, that's the end of this. We're just gonna wipe everything out, just destroy all this stuff because it's become idolatrous." With the Matzavah, it's very clear that those were at times legitimate. With the Asherah, translated sometimes as groves, that's more difficult to tell. Definitely, it's used very often in pagan stuff and sort of fertility stuff, and but it may occasionally have been used as a good thing, like altars, right? It's not really altars that are the problem; it's altars to pagan gods that are the problem, and that's what ends up getting destroyed a lot of times. Um, and so Hezekiah actually he really goes all the way with this. He has all these temples shut down because they had become idolatrous, or at least partially idolatrous, and says, listen, I need to be able to control what happens in these temples, so I'm only leaving one open, and it's the one in my backyard. Hezekiah literally lives right next to the temple in Jerusalem and says, this is the only one we're leaving open so that I make sure that we're doing the right stuff here and we're not worshiping other gods with Jehovah or just straight up worshiping other gods. So he cleans up the worship system. And you really gotta hand it to him for that. So, but this brings us to some of the major issues that show up in the book of Isaiah. Hezekiah fixing this place up. He has kind of some problems. He has some problems as he's trying to clean things up. Because what do you do when, for example, you have totally legitimate priests, but they're operating in temples outside Jerusalem that we know now were probably quite legitimate. There's some misleading edits of Deuteronomy to make it seem like it wasn't like that, but probably these were legitimate temples, but Hezekiah has to shut them down. And so what do you do with all these legitimate priests? Not all of them are legitimate, but a lot of them would have been. What do you do with all these legitimate priests? You can't have them all work at a temple, can you? That's a lot of priests at one temple. Well, Hezekiah has to deal with this. And so Isaiah will comment on that. But in chapter 6, he's commenting on this period when eventually we're not going to have to deal with priests anymore, all these problems we're having with priests, because everybody is going to have an unmediated experience with the divine. And a lot of the issues that come in with the book of Isaiah come because of the Assyrians, because number one, Judah sort of has to protect themselves from the Assyrians. And the Assyrian Empire is massive, covers Iraq, covers a lot of Turkey. It's just this massive, massive empire down to Egypt. It's just huge. And they have to protect themselves from this huge empire. And they kind of do the best they can with it. But they really come very, very close to getting wiped out. They're like this close to being wiped out before God finally saves them. A whole bunch of people get taken away by the Assyrians. Not just the 10 tribes get lost. The Assyrians come in 722-ish, and they take away the 10 tribes. They scatter them around to other places to work. But also, a lot of Judah gets taken out too, and it's like just Jerusalem that's left. Lachish, you can see today, Lachish down in Judah got totally demolished and totally taken out by the Assyrians. So these guys are really very, very close to just getting totally destroyed. But God, as Jerusalem is being besieged, it's probably going to be destroyed. God saves them by wiping out a whole bunch of Assyrians in one night, and then after that they're afraid their army is too small to defend themselves from the guys down in what's today sort of Ethiopia, Sudan area, who are pushing up north to try to deal with the Assyrian Empire. And so they say, we're not strong enough to deal with the Egyptians or the Nubian Egyptians, and with now that we're weakened, so we need to get out of here. So they run away, and Jerusalem lives to fight another day. But this all is, they're really hanging on by a shoestring here, and they end up surviving, but really just barely. And since all these people are taken away, Isaiah talks a lot about issues connected to that, issues connected with sort of scattering and gathering, because it's very much on his mind, because the Assyrians have taken all these people away. He does so especially later on in the book, most especially chapters 40 through 55-ish. He talks a lot about that kind of thing. And in fact, some people have looked at that section and said, well, this is written by another person. This can't be written by Isaiah because he's talking all about all these captives getting taken away and then people returning. Well, yeah, so they say, well, it's got to be the Babylonian captivity he's talking about, not anything else. Well, the Assyrians took away a huge number of people, and that's during Isaiah's lifetime. So it's not the Babylonian captivity, it's the Assyrian captivity he's talking about. And so he has to deal with a lot of those issues, and so he talks a lot about that kind of thing. And like I said, people actually think that Isaiah was written by 3 different authors because of different subject matter that's being discussed. They think the first, chapter 1 roughly through chapter 40 is by Isaiah, and then 1 through 39 is Isaiah, 40 through 55 they call second Isaiah, which is somebody during the time when they're in Babylon. And then the rest, the end section, is written by this other guy. But really, the reason they came up with this theory is because they forgot, the Assyrians took a huge number of people away. And so stuff that seems like it's written in Babylon, sort of wistfully thinking about getting the gang back together, well, it's because the gang definitely is not together during Isaiah's lifetime. Everybody's gotten taken away. The 10 tribes got taken away, and a whole bunch of Judea got taken away. The kingdom of Judah got taken away up to just scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire. So a lot of these issues that seem like they're later concerns really directly play into Isaiah's time. So this is, people will talk about 3 different Isaiahs and all this mess. No, it's just one Isaiah, but he's not talking about the Babylonian issues. He's talking about Assyrian Empire issues. Now, thankfully, we have the Book of Mormon. Were it not for the Book of Mormon, there would be some question as to what he was talking about. But because things from this second part of Isaiah are quoted in the Book of Mormon, we can be confident that it's all really written at one time during Isaiah's lifetime. Even the last part, the last section, 55 through the end, is not quoted much in the Book of Mormon, if at all, so that there is maybe some suspicion that that's written later. But probably it's all written at one time and then edited later. We can see from the Book of Mormon there does seem to be some editing involved, and that's probably where we get 3 different flavors. I assume that Isaiah wrote it. Some of it may have been edited then during the captivity, not as much as people think, but some of it, and then some probably edited a 3rd round later on after they have gotten back and come back to build the temple again. So that's anyway, that's one of the major issues with Isaiah that thankfully is resolved by the Book of Mormon. This is really all written during Isaiah's time, but it's talking about the Assyrian issues, not Babylonian issues. One other thing is people say the style changes. You can see 2 different style changes, 3 distinct writing styles in the book of Isaiah. But one thing to consider, this is probably compiled over the course of Isaiah's entire lifetime. So when you think about, if you want to talk about style change from one point of your life to another point of your life, let's talk about J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Go read The Hobbit, go read The Lord of the Rings. You would be surprised to find that that's by the same person, at least I was when I was a kid. Very, very different style. And probably that's what we're seeing here. Isaiah, as he gets older, his style changes. And, nothing wrong with that, but that explains why it does seem a little bit different. So this does, almost certainly, this is all during Isaiah's lifetime, all by Isaiah. But he's dealing with issues that come up because of the Assyrian Empire, sort of as they appear. Now, eventually, things are going to be sort of resolved with the Assyrian Empire, but only for a very short time, because after that, the Babylonian Empire is going to come in, and even though Jerusalem was saved from the Assyrians, Jerusalem was not going to be saved from the Babylonians. The Babylonians are going to come in, they're going to destroy the temple, and they're going to take everybody away. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about something that we see from Isaiah chapter 6. With this in mind, that the Babylonians eventually are going to come in, ruin the temple, and take everyone away, but also in light of Hezekiah's religious reforms, now I'd like to come back and talk about the last verse of Isaiah 6 and kind of make sense of it. By the way, I got that completely wrong last time. Just totally ignore everything I said. I realized I was looking at the text and I thought Isaiah might be addressing a very controversial topic, but I thought, well, no, probably not. It's probably something else. And then the more I looked at it, I realized, no, Isaiah really did go there. Sometimes I can't believe that Isaiah addresses the topics that he addresses, but yeah, he totally just went there. So we're going to talk about that. In the last part of Isaiah 6, it's not translated terribly well in the King James, and by terribly well, I mean it's pretty terrible. But it says, but yet in it shall be a tenth. Remember, he's talking about how everything's going to get destroyed, and there's just going to be a little bit left. So he says, but yet in it shall be a tenth, and it shall return and be eaten as a teal tree and as an oak, whose substance is in them when they cast their leaves. So the holy seed shall be the substance thereof. Doesn't really make any sense. But when you realize that Isaiah likes to make little jokes, and when you read it in light of the upcoming Hezekiah reforms, because that's really Isaiah's on the cusp of something new with these new reforms. And so in 13, this is a nod to that, I think. So when we look at it in Hebrew, it really is quite different. It says, but yet in her will be a tenth. Now that's a strange word to use, but it's a pun. One of Isaiah's famous puns. He's talking about something later on in the verse. So in it will be a tenth, which is called an ashriya. That's the word for tenth. So a small number of people will be left, and even they will be carried away. Is how it should be translated. So there'll be a tenth, but even they will be carried away, and they will be burned like a sacred oak or a sacred terebinth. And then probably the next word should be an ashriya, just like that tenth. It's a very, very similar word, very subtly different. But it is a sacred, one of these sacred tree kind of things used in worship. Probably in this context, this is when Hezekiah has sort of said, we're getting rid of all this stuff, right? So this is probably alluding to Isaiah seeing this coming up very quickly in his own lifetime. Just all these sacred trees that you have, all of that is going to get burned. Okay, all of it's going to get destroyed. Okay, and then he says, and cut down or toppled over like a matzevot, those sacred stones, toppled over like a matzevot on a bama, which is a high place used for worship. And like I said, there were legitimate high places that were appropriate for worship, but Hezekiah says, nope, I'm shutting them all down. And in fact, archaeologically, this is a very kind of sweet detail. They have these, we can see that they have buried some of these sacred stones, but it's like they've given them funerals. They've buried them very, very carefully. So Hezekiah apparently came through and ruined some of them, but then as people heard that this was happening, they said, no, well, let's just take care of these. So they very, very carefully bury them, sort of ritually bury some of these sacred stones to make sure that they don't get ruined. Kind of interesting, kind of a sort of a tender detail there. So they come in and they sort of, you guys are going to be, some of you are going to be left, a tenth is going to be left, but even you will be taken away, and it'll be like you're being burned like these sacred oaks and sacred trees, and pushed over like you would push a sacred stone off of a high place. Okay, sent over like you push the sacred stone off of a high place. And then explicitly it explains what he's been talking about. The holy seed is the sacred stone, is the matzevah. So you guys at the Jerusalem temple, you're going to be spared. There's going to be just a handful of you left after the Assyrians come, and you are going to be spared. But eventually, you guys are going to get taken out by the Babylonians, just like Hezekiah eventually is going to go through and knock over all these sacred things that you've had at all these high places and destroy all this stuff. You guys are going to be taken out and pushed off the mountain, metaphorically speaking, just like Hezekiah is literally going to take all these matzevot and sacred stones and everything else and throw them off the high places. So a direct prediction of what's going to happen when the Babylonians roll in. That, yeah, Jerusalem's going to be left, but then eventually even Jerusalem is going to be taken out. And that is, of course, exactly what plays out. But just to make sense of this one verse, you had to have the whole context of the Hezekiah religious reforms as well as the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So now, that verse made sense 45 years later. So the next chapter, a lot of it is very historical, and so now with this chapter under your belt, it'll make a lot more sense. So one last thing about chapter 6. It is difficult to understand why God would want Isaiah to speak so cryptically, so only part of the audience understands, make their ears heavy and shut their eyes, right? Jacob 4 explains this much better. I'm just going to read that verse. Jacob 4:14 almost certainly is an allusion to Isaiah chapter 6. So he says, "But behold, the Jews were a stiff-necked people, and they despised the words of plainness, and killed the prophets, and sought for things that they could not understand. Wherefore, because of their blindness, which blindness came by looking beyond the mark, they must needs fall. For God hath taken away his plainness from them, and delivered unto him many things which they cannot understand, because they desired it. And because they desired it, God hath done it, that they may stumble." So I think it's very clear there. Yep, God gave them Isaiah, things that they could not understand. They're only understanding this on a very, very basic level. Now, some people are understanding it on a higher level because Isaiah is double coding, but they asked for it, so they got it. I'm fairly confident that that's what we're talking about here. Also, I think the law of Moses to some extent falls into that category. It's sort of a symbolic thing. They didn't listen originally to Moses, so they got the law of Moses instead. But I think definitely Isaiah falls under this umbrella that many things which they couldn't understand because they asked for it, and because they asked for it, God gave it to them, but it's not going to end well for them. Now, luckily, like I said, Isaiah does speak on multiple levels, so speaks to multiple audiences at once, so we can sort of make a higher sense of some of these things. But I think that sort of explains chapter 6. The verse in chapter 6 and then that verse, I think, really sum up a lot of what is going on in Isaiah. So anyway, that's enough of that for today. This is the historical context, so that as we continue to go through, we can make a little bit of sense of it. So next time we'll be going through and talking about chapter 7, so I will see you guys next time.